Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. This is Jessica. I am your host for the podcast, but I also have an amazing co-host with me who is, would you like to introduce yourself, amazing co-host?
Oh, hi. Thank you. I'm Jen. It's good to be here.
And we are here with somebody who, you did a book called Stone Cold Fox, which was so good. And you also were here for a virtual event last year about horror and film, which was also so good, about the movie Torn Hearts, which was amazing. Yeah, Jen has watched it as well. After I interviewed you and I watched the movie, I'm like, Jen, you need to watch this movie. It was so good. And now we are here with a book called we love the nightlife. We like the nightlife. We love the nightlife. Now
we love it. We
yeah,
love the nightlife.
We love it. We love it. We love it. Yes, which is the song. And it is kind of a combination in a way of both of the works, in the sense that I was telling another librarian about it, that it is a vampire story, but it's also it can also be almost read as more of a mainstream thriller toxic relationship story. And if vampires are not your thing, you might still like this story, but if vampires are your thing, you will also like this story. So thank you so much, and welcome, Rachel Kohler Croft. I am having a day where, Rachel Kohler Croft, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Jessica. It's so nice to meet you, Jen. I'm excited to be back on your lovely podcast to talk about We Love the Nightlife, which I feel like you pitched it so well for me, because I do feel like when I announced that I was writing a vampire book, people were like, okay, what are you doing? But it is sort of like the window dressing in some ways to a story about a friendship that I really wanted to tell. And I think this partially has to do with some of my screenwriting background and trying to think of like genre mashups and unique ways of raising the stakes and how to make something feel inert, just more exciting. Because I did want to write about a female friendship gone awry. And I think sometimes there is this notion of, well, I'll just make a new friend. Like, it doesn't feel like high stakes. So I was like, how can I make this a little more sexy and sellable? And I personally like vampire stories because I think of all the creatures, vampires are hot and scary, which I think is the best combo. So I feel like they really worked for my brand, which, Jessica, as you know, I call bitches and glamour.
Oh my goodness, so well. And because there is this decadence to being a vampire, you build wealth, you build status. What I loved about this, again, which I think made it very accessible, is that it didn't, not that there's anything wrong with Anne Rice type vampires. And I know Jen has something she wants to mention about that later, which the two of us were like on the same page about. But it was you kind of did Nicola, who is our vampire from the 1800s, who is sort of the vampire who brings Amber into the world of vampires in 1979, by the way. She does have some of that old decadence, but it is very modern too, and not in the way that she's walking around like she still belongs in the 1800s. Like, she's modern, she really is. And their friendship, again, it translates very well to just how competitive friendships can be between women.
Yeah, and I think vampires would, or my vampires that I created, I wanted them to feel very modern, because I think, I don't know, if I personally were a vampire, I would want to stay current. It's kind of one of the gifts of being alive for so long, which I'm sure there are a lot of negatives to that too, which I kind of explore in the book. But I think one of the cool things about it would be seeing what there is to see in the modern day. So I wanted to make sure the girls were staying current. Obviously, Amber maybe more open to it than Nicola in some ways, but yeah, that was something that was really important to me. And and speaking of Anne Rice, which I do love her books, and the 1994 adaptation of Interview with the Vampire like changed my life when I was a child. I was very like, wow, every single man in this movie is so hot. And but I also felt like a lot of vampire stories, and I enjoyed them, True Blood and the Charlaine Harris books being one of them too, just often revolve so much around men and love interests and things like that, which I really enjoy. But I was like, where's our girly vampire book? I'm gonna write one. So, and I think in terms of their friendship and how things can go toxic, I think it had to do sometimes with their longevity. I also think there was a big control element at play, which, like, Jen, I don't know if you picked up on it, but I was like very inspired by Lestat and Louis in a lot of ways, and like the creator and maker. So like, if you are an Anne Rice girly, I think you will see where my influences are in there. But women are different and play by different rules. And also these two women come from different countries. They have different backgrounds, which you come to learn as the story goes on. And I think they were unfortunately, you know, doomed for a clash in a lot of ways. But I also wanted to show that they did have good times together. And like any friendship, sometimes you just outgrow each other, or it doesn't work anymore. And it's maybe the right thing to do, but it's really sad. And it's just really complex. And that's as I started writing this and bouncing between decades and even going back a few chapters to like Nicola's childhood in the Victorian times, it just became this like really sweeping story that I wasn't totally expecting when I started drafting. But I felt like it really added layers to their friendship and their individual characters, because both of them are really important to me, and I love them both for different reasons. I do think, because I got a lot of flack for not having any likable characters in Stone Cold Fox. I disagree. However, I did make it a point. I was like, I think Amber is quite likable, and Nicola is more of the baddie in this one, and I love them both. But I channeled a lot of myself, my mother, and my best friend Liz to kind of build the character of Amber. I think she's a blast.
That's so great that you answered my question about Lestat and Louis before I even asked it. So that's fantastic. So instead, my question is about the setting in both in time and place, and why you chose it and what kind of research you did. Because a slight personal anecdote, in the late 90s, when I was in high school, my life was changed by Velvet Goldmine and the introduction to David Bowie and like just London at that time. So could you talk about, yeah, why you chose to set it there and like what sort of research you did to bring it to life?
Sure. It's a convoluted answer, but it's fun. So I thought of this idea initially. I was watching a documentary on Studio 54. I think it's still streaming on Amazon Prime, but they interview Ian Schrager, and I just really like disco and dancing in that time. I didn't live during that time, but I romanticize it for some reason. I love hearing about it firsthand from like my mother, for example. And so I'm watching this documentary initially for, you know, like the vibes. And then what my big takeaway from it was, I thought the friendship between Ian Schrager and Steve Rubell was so sweet. Like in this way, even though they did like tax evasion and all this like terrible stuff or whatever, like you could just tell that they really loved and cared for each other. And I thought that was really cool. And at least as a viewer, it was unexpected. And I don't know, that the wheels just started turning. I was like, well, what would it have looked like if two women opened a nightclub back then? What would their friendship have looked like? And then, I mean, I have a visceral memory. I was walking my dog. This is when I still lived in the marina. And like, I heard like the sea lions and we're going about our day. And I was like, and what if they were vampires? And I was just like, I've got it. So as I'm like starting to like ideate and figure them out, I was initially going to set it in New York or LA. I was kind of deciding, because Stone Cold Fox took place in New York, so I kind of didn't want to set it there. And I live in LA, so I was kind of leaning towards LA. But I have a long storied history with England. I've just always loved it. I did my year abroad there. I had a boyfriend there long ago. My father-in-law is from Yorkshire, so there's just a lot going on for me with England. And then, as luck would have it, my husband and I got to move there for a few months in 2022. Yes. And it was very, very exciting. We were there for his job and lived in the middle of Soho. And as I was coming up with this idea, I was like, why don't I just set it here in London? And then I felt even stronger that that was the right move because of the vampire of it all. I'm like, okay, it's an older place. I can really play into some of these tropes in like a fun and fresh way. And I love London so much. It's my favorite city in the whole world. I got to go back the year after for another month. I took my mom there earlier this year. Like with my husband and I, we spent a lot of time there. It's like my second home. And so it just became, once I started playing with London as the setting, certain things just got easier, and I knew that was the move. So that's the answer to that question.
So I was born in 1979 myself.
Cool.
Yeah, right. It seems like it should be, but it's really interesting because it kind of brings up something just about how people remember decades. Like I kind of think about how, everybody's like the 70s was totally the disco age, but everybody, it's almost like the 60s. People think of the 60s as the psychedelic hippie age, but that was kind of towards the end, and it bled into
Yeah.
the early to very, very early mid 70s. And then things kind of started to turn. And we still had disco in the 80s for a little while too. And then people think
Yeah.
of the big hair as the 80s. And then I'm like, yeah, that was like maybe 88, like, where when people nostalgize certain fashions and certain social movements that are fashion and pop culture based, I feel like they don't always, they consider the entire decade when it happened that, but it's not. And
Yeah.
that's why I loved that this was set in 1979, because it just kind of drives that home. It's like, yeah, the 80s was the 80s, but also we were still going through this movement. Yeah.
And I had to think a lot too, where because I often feel in the UK and Europe, sometimes they're ahead of us musically, sometimes they're not. But like at that time, I feel like disco was actually rapidly ending in the back end of 79 and into the 80s. And I kind of start talking about the new romantics and things like that, and how punk was even over. And it's sort of symbolic of like they met at this time where they thought this was going to be like this way forever. And Nicola always knew it was going to end, but because Amber's, young and new to the country and everything that's going on. So I just wanted to make sure I did enough, pop culture research, but also I didn't think my vampires would be like so into current events necessarily, but they would know a little bit what's going on, particularly Nicola, who's like seen everything at this point. But the 70s in England were pretty tumultuous for a host of reasons, politically and economically. And she obviously, picks up on that when the tides are kind of changing in the 80s and Margaret Thatcher, but it's like not the focus of the novel. But I wanted to make sure there were things about reality like peppered in there. And then meanwhile, disco here lasted, I think, a little bit longer maybe than it did in London. And, when Saturday Night Fever came out, like that's when disco became mainstream, and then it wasn't cool anymore. I mean, it was cool like for people all over that just wanted to go out and dance or whatever, but if you were on the forefront of something and then all of a sudden it becomes for everybody, a little bit of the magic sometimes can be lost. So I think that was one of the themes I was exploring too. But I did want to make sure, and I talked to, this is kind of a fun story because my husband was filming this show in Istanbul. So he was gone from London for a couple weeks, and I'm very comfortable traveling by myself and popping around. And I don't know, it was like 10 days in. So I was sort of like starting to miss them. And I'm like, it was a rainy day, and I went in this bookstore and bought a book. And then I walked past this restaurant. It was like champagne and oysters, 20 pounds. I was like, that sounds lovely. I'm going to go sit in here, have a glass of champagne, eat oysters, and read my book. And these three fabulous ladies come in, obviously having like a day together, shopping, gabbing, and they sit right next to me. I was like, oh, I feel it now. We're making friends today. And they would have been around Amber and Nicola's age in 1979 in the early 80s. And I'm talking to them about everything. When I go back to London, we end up going together. There's a scene where the girls go to Black's, this club in Soho. My friend Deborah that I met that day is a member. She brought me there, and I got to see it all. So like almost every place in the novel is something that I've attended or have a touch point to or something to that effect. But I did like a combination of like, my Google internet research, boots on the ground research, and then just like talking to people that were alive and in London at that point that were kind of in the nightlife mix to make it feel more real.
There was this nightclub called Culture Club.
Oh,
That was like a
Boy George.
yes, but it was like a retro, nightclub. And depending on where you go, like some of them had 3 floors, and like you had the 70s on one floor, the 80s in the middle, and then whatever.
Oh.
But the one that I recall going to, it started out like early in the night, it was all disco. Then it switched to really more of the 80s stuff. And then as soon as they started playing Nirvana, you knew that the 80s were over. And like disco,
Yeah.
disco was ending, the 80s, and then nope, Smells Like Teen Spirit, it's time to go. But it had all of that glam. And I think one of the things that was interesting, and you talk about this a little bit, is yeah, Nicola she's very big on understanding the changes of things, and because she knows, but she also is very stuck in the past too.
Yeah.
She's very, very stuck in the past, and her nostalgia is almost for something that maybe didn't exist the way that she wanted it to, which is, I think, is the nostalgia trap in general.
Yes.
Really was a big flaw both in her original life before she became a vampire, and then in her vampiric life.
Yeah. Nicola, I don't want to say too much, so I don't want to spoil the book, but I feel for her in a lot of ways. I don't think she had the life that she thought she was going to have. And instead of being an adult or a grown-up about anything, she just kind of manipulates everybody around her, which I think is part of the fun of being a vampire too. You're kind of stuck in the age that you turn. And even though these girls in the present timeline, Nicola's close to 200 years old, and Amber is technically, I guess, would be in her 60s. They still turned when they were, in their early 20s, and it's kind of a mishmash of being stuck at that age, but also still progressing through life, but without experiencing anything as an older person, physically. It's just, it was a really interesting thing to play with in terms of like their age, their level of maturity. Both things they would be mature about and things that they wouldn't. It was just kind of a fun, freeing way to play with these characters because they're sort of ageless in a very strange way. And that's kind of the fun about having a supernatural element in your story. You can I'm sure you noticed, I didn't really reinvent the vampire for the story. I used a lot of vampire lore that most people are very familiar with because I did want it to be very accessible. But it was fun to just kind of use the vampire stuff at my leisure to serve the story or the character.
I would love if you could talk a little bit more about our dynamic duo, or not so dynamic duo because they are still in the same age, but and crafting their dynamic. And this is usually a question that I ask to writers of romantic comedy, but I think it has a lot of application to toxic female friendships too, which is like, how do you manage that tension and like the balance between like what is pulling them together, keeping them together, and what is pushing them apart. And since they have like eternity, that like almost raises the stakes, right? Because if they don't do something, then they're just going to be in this situation forever. So could you talk about, like crafting that tension dynamic? And does that happen at like the character phase or in the plotting phase? Like, how's that work for you?
It's probably a little bit of both. I mean, there was sort of a theme that emerged. I was writing, and it is something that I just always sort of like look back on myself like, like you kind of do have to beware the good time friend because they're so fun. You can have a great time with them. And they are important for a very specific part of your life. But sometimes you reach a breaking point where you're like, God, like, if I went on vacation, would I trust this person to watch my dog? Could I tell this person a secret? Like if I'm in trouble and I call them, will they be there? Maybe, maybe not. And it just helps you like kind of evaluate. So I love a good time friend. I think they're important. But I think if you're not going in, and you can't go in with your eyes wide open when you're younger because you don't know yet. But hindsight is 2020. And, you know, I think about some friends that I've like lost over the years just because we weren't growing together. And I don't look back on it anymore with like an upset or a sadness, but I do remember feeling disappointed that the friendship wasn't as strong as I had thought it was because of the sheer amount of time we used to spend together. You know, you're constantly out and about. I mean, I don't know about you girls, but I still am kind of a party girl in some ways, but like I was out all the time with my girlfriends having a good time. I mean, that was all like ripped from my own headlines. Like I used a lot of my nightlife experience for this book. And so I just kind of kept that good time friend thing as the North Star. And ultimately, you know, there's a push-pull there because you do have so much good. But when you start to realize the bad slowly over time, it can be this really devastating realization. Obviously for Nicola and Amber, they're vampires, and Nicola's been lying to Amber in a very big way for basically their whole life together. It changes everything for Amber and kind of sets her on her quest to get out of there. But she has to be very careful because I don't think she really knew who she was dealing with until she starts getting some secondhand information as well and kind of puts her detective hat on and figure out who Nicola Crofton really is.
So there's a few other vampires who are side characters in the story. There is Margot and Tamsin, who have their own history together, but it's very much sort of like this off-screen alluded to situation for a while. In your mind, do you have backstories for them?
Yeah, you know, it's the thing with these books, right? Like I felt like I could have written, like I could have done like an Anne Rice tome for this book, but you know, what I do are thrillers. I mean, I had to keep it propulsive, without sacrificing the fun details of a vampire story, because I do really appreciate the genre and wanted to like do right by it. But at the heart of the story, it is a thriller, and you just have to keep it snappy. So I did have, you know, allusions to what maybe went on with Tamsin and Margot and Tamsin and Nicola. And then like, I love Pierce and all his like ragtag gang of vampires he's acquired over the years. So it is like a really fleshed out world in my mind. And maybe it's something I could revisit in the future or like visit for, you know, TV series or a movie or something to that respect. But I think it all, at the end of the day, had to serve Nicola and Amber's story. So I peppered in what I could. But yeah, to me, like I know all their business.
I would love to see it.
Thanks.
For real. You know, I love their plan, you know, to sort of like to open the nightclub. Like in your head, because what immediately occurred to me, I was like, oh, this is like when the fighting married couple like gets a golden retriever puppy or has a baby, you know, like is that their baby? Like
100%.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, you know, Amber's like made up her mind in a lot of ways, but this is something, and Nicola knows that it's going to be tempting for Amber because it is the thing that brought them together in so many ways. And what would it look like if it was all on their terms? And like, and Nicola rarely has an interest in doing something super modern or new in many ways. And I think, you know, in a lot of ways it was her olive branch. Maybe it works out, maybe it doesn't. But it was kind of a fun thing to play with because that's where like the Studio 54 inspiration kind of came from, and talking about, you know, what fixtures they were going to put in and who the DJs were going to be. Like that, as a writer, that was just really fun to write, and what the rules are and who's going to be on the list and all that stuff.
Yeah, it was super fun. And I mean, aside from the vampire thing, I totally would have wanted to go there.
No,
Yeah,
same. I was
right?
like, I'm gonna make, because I do think, and this is something I just like really struggle with, and maybe you guys too, because I always want to stay current. I always want to know what's going on. But there is something about like modern times and technology that I feel just has like taken like the grit and the glamour out of certain spaces, namely dancing in nightclubs and things like that. I mean, I love the idea of a nightclub that's trying to be like something out of 1979 and you can't bring your phone in and there's a list and doorman. Like that's so retro and cool and something that I feel like would be really tricky to find. I'm sure something out there exists that I just don't have the pulse on anymore because I'm no longer in my party girl phase, which is okay. But I wanted to think about what my ideal nightclub would be in the middle of London, and that was, and Hey Mister is it.
I think I am out of questions. Do you have any more, Jessica?
So my questions would be bordering on spoilers, and I don't want to
I
spoil this
know
for
it's tough because there
anybody.
are so many things to discuss. It's more of like a book club discussion. But I appreciate all the enthusiasm and I'm excited that you guys liked it so much because it was a really hard book to write. Like, I don't want to say Stone Cold Fox was easy because no book is easy to write. You're a crazy person if you write books. But the thing about Stone Cold Fox, aside from like the handful of flashbacks, it was very chronological. I was in her voice the whole time. I felt very like connected to Bea, like I knew what she would do for in every situation. And like, here's my second book. I'm like, okay, I want to do lots of decades. I'm going to set it in another country. I'm also going to add vampires, and I'm going to do two voices that sound completely different. Like, it was such a structurally a really, like, this is the first time in my life that I've done like the index card thing, right? Because there was everything by the end had to line up, and there were so many seeds that I planted on purpose. When I read it after a draft, there would be seeds I realized that were planted not on purpose, but they were really cool. And I wanted to make sure they would pay off. Like, it was just, I don't know. Again, Stone Cold Fox spanned maybe like 6 months to a year, and this book spanned like 50 years. And then even like going back to Victorian times. So there was just a lot there, but a lot of it is so much of stuff, so many things that I just like love as a reader that I feel really lucky I got to like trick into one single book. Cause like I love vampires. I love girls getting into trouble. I love nightclubs. I love a sad Victorian child because I love like the secret garden and things like that. I even snuck in like a pit bull conga line because I love pit bull. Like, I really like put, when people are like, oh, this is the book of my heart because it's like something really meaningful to them. This is the book of my heart because it just has all the stuff I love in one book. And I agree with you, Jessica, that I don't want people that don't read vampire stuff to be deterred because like truly, I mean, I love Anne Rice and I read Charlene Harris's books, but like other than that, I'm not the biggest like vampire girly. It's actually more like movies for me for some reason. So I love how it works for this book because it just adds to the tension and adds to the overall vibe. I love spooky things and scary things, and it just kind of gave it like a little light horror bent. But at the end of the day, it is about two women and their friendship going completely off the rails.
And I think even if you were to compare it to like your film work, like Torn Hearts, when you compare like just like the epicness and the sprawling nature of We Love the Nightlife, like Torn Hearts is like after the first couple scenes, like a bottle episode almost, like then you don't leave that house. And so it's really interesting to see like you exploring like the dynamics between women in all these different sort of like frameworks and in spaces.
Thank you. And then we didn't even really talk about her, but I think Courtney Cooper is such a cool character. And I love how that friendship with her and Amber and her and Nicola develops over the story too. Because I never have this like, oh, being friends with women is for the birds, because that's not really my intention, but more about like, do these relationships like serve me as I grow, and they're complicated and it's not so black and white.
Courtney is somebody I thought about bringing up, but again, like something I have questions about her, and I don't want to. I don't want to spoil too much into. I don't want to spoil
pawn
it.
in their game. She's a pawn in their game. That's for sure.
That she is a pawn in their game. So before we go, I mean, is there anything? What have you got coming up? Anything?
Aside from the book, or just
new book. You got a new book. Are you writing anything else at the moment?
Oh yes. So it's funny, when I had Stone Cold Fox and doing all the podcasts and things like that, We Love the Nightlife was already like, I was in the zone, and which was cool, but it was a lot. And so I know what my third book's going to be, I think, but I'm still playing around with some stuff. So it's still super early days on that. So nothing major to share, but I am leaning towards exploring a marriage for my third book as the relationship, because I love a marriage thriller and I have a couple of really fun ideas. So I'm excited to keep going, but it's too early to say, but I'm trying to, it's actually this author who I love, Vanessa Lilly. She wrote Blood Sisters, and she's a very, very gifted tarot reader. And I don't know if you saw, all the Thriller girlies were together recently at Thriller Fest in New York, and she was doing tarot readings, and her reading for me was she's touched. Like, if you can get a tarot reading by Vanessa Lilly, I fully encourage it. But it was so spot on about what I needed to hear. And it was about like to approach my work sometimes from a more childlike, fun lens instead of, I can be kind of intense. I'm sure it doesn't seem that way because I'm very friendly and fun, but like professionally, I can be very intense. And it was sort of like the permission I needed to hear, like, oh, this doesn't have to be so like all consuming in like a negative way, but it can consume me in like the way you were obsessed with something when you were a kid and went all in. So I'm trying to approach it from that lens this time.
Thank you so much. This was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. And my co-host was
Jen, goodbye.
and our guest was
Rachel Kohler Croft. Thanks so much for having me.
check out We Love the Night Life. You like vampires? Awesome. You are lukewarm on vampires, unsure, but you like thrillers about women who have friendships that are a bit toxic. Check this one out too. You like the 70s, you like the 80s, check it out. And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.